There's a cartoon, and it pictures a medieval crusader. Everybody remembers the Crusades, right? He's standing in full armor, and he's holding his shield, but he also has this really long, really sharp spear, and it's at the throat of a prisoner on the ground. You can just picture it, right? And he's got this sword, this spear right at his throat. And the caption of the prisoner on the ground says, "Tell me more, sir, about this Christianity. I'm terribly interested." Right? And this guy's about ready to kill him. That's actually the kind of picture that lots of Christians and non-Christians have of what we're going to talk about this morning, which is basically evangelism. However, as Jesus encounters men and women in the Gospels, he defines a different type of evangelism, a gracious, personal interaction with needy people. And this woman in John 4 this morning obviously has deep needs. By every human standard, she really didn't matter to anybody. For one, she's a woman in a culture that viewed women as less than fully human. They had very few rights and were basically considered to be property. She's also a Samaritan. Samaritans were despised by surrounding peoples, particularly the Jews. But in his typical amazing way, Jesus transforms this woman's life, and he simultaneously models for us the sort of personal witnessing that he calls us to. And he shows us how to do it. First off, he connects with thirsty people. Thirsty people in this instance really is thirsty. They're at the well because they're thirsty, but thirsty also for love and salvation. This account exemplifies how Jesus met people on their own turf. You see, harvesters, they have to get into the field. Fishermen have to go where the fish are, right? It's said that you can fish in your bathtub and it's super convenient, but it's not going to be very effective, right? Although it might be fun, get some fish and put them in, anyway. That's the difference between expecting people to come to us and going to them, particularly in today's society, and particularly now with this crazy coronavirus. Sometimes we have to meet people out in their world. Jesus had 132 contacts with people in the Gospels. 6 were in the temple and 4 were in the synagogues. How many does that leave? 122 that were done out in real life situations where he met people. Not at the temple, not at the synagogue, but out doing life. A lot of the early missionaries, they made mistakes in their evangelism, and this is what I mean by that. They would go to people and they would find a person of peace. They would find somebody in, say, a village that was hungry for the knowledge of God, hungry for Jesus, for salvation. They would find that one lightning rod that was just lit up by the information. But then they would pick him up and pull this person out of their culture and bring them with them, right? Bring them with them when they had this perfect opportunity, just like the woman, the Samaritan woman. She went back to her village. Jesus could have said to her, "Hey, now that you believe, come on, come with us." But what did he do? He let her go back to her village. And then it was like yeast, right? It said a lot of people believed. And that's what a lot of the early missionaries made a mistake in doing. But how does Jesus connect here? How does he show us how to connect? He begins by crossing barriers, some various barriers, to demonstrate this woman's value. First of all, he crossed the obvious cultural barriers. Samaritans were a mixed race, and they mixed their worship between God and pagan gods, right? So the Jews just despised them. Then Jesus also crossed social barriers. This woman, there's 2 odd things in this story. There's actually a well that's closer that she could have gone to, and we know that through history. Secondly, women would come to get their water either early or late. Because why? To avoid the heat, right? Well, this woman has done 2 things. She's been forced to go further to get away, and she's also forced to come at noon when it's the hottest, right? Because She doesn't want to run into any of the proper women, right? You see, women had no power, and this one already had a shady reputation by first century standards. With her reputation, no respectable Jewish man would talk to her, and certainly no rabbi would ever engage a woman in spiritual conversation publicly. But Jesus ignored these social and gender barriers because all that was meaningless compared to God's value on this woman. And then he also crossed religious barriers. The disciples were raised in a culture that was greatly different than the Samaritan culture. And as we read, they're like shocked out of their minds. They're blown away when they get back and find Jesus talking to a Samaritan woman, right? But he's not concerned about his disciples' opinions of his actions. He forces his followers, and consequently us, to take a hard look at our cultural attitudes, especially when they're self-righteous ones. He connected by crossing barriers to put himself in contact with this woman. He also connects by using human need to teach spiritual truth. She comes to draw water, a physical human need. Jesus says to her, "Will you give me a drink?" And she's aghast. She's just blown away. "You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you even think about asking me for a drink?" But then he stirs the pot. He stirs her interest a little bit by making her an incredible offer. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. What is this living water that Jesus talks about? Jesus is offering her spiritual life. She needs to experience the Holy Spirit who will come into her life and make her new. He wants her to be born again. Born again. Does that ring a bell? Remember? But like Nicodemus, who we talked about last week or the week before in John 3, she doesn't get it. She misunderstands. She goes to back to the practical. She says, "You have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep." She knew Jesus spoke truth, though, when he said, "Drink this well water and you'll get thirsty again." She'd been coming to that well for years, probably mostly in shame. But there's a water that's different, he says. "I'm offering you living water. And the one who drinks it will never get thirsty again." That sounds pretty good, right? Secondly, Jesus shows people their need, right? Now, notice how Jesus takes the lid off the Pandora's box, if you will, of this woman's incredible needs in her heart by raising the sin issue. He cracks the door open by saying, go call your husband, right? Go call your husband. He's baiting her a little bit. He hasn't yet demonstrated that he knows her life like an open book, right? But he said he puts his finger on the symptom, which demonstrates the real sin issue in her life, and she answers him probably meekly, right? Kind of like, "I don't have a husband." He's like, "I'm sorry?" Right? "I don't have a husband." All the pain and the guilt of her existence, her past life littered with sin and failure and exclusion and rejection and guilt and unfulfilled desires, is exposed in that moment. Jesus knew she'd had 5 husbands. He knew she was the immoral pariah, outcast of that village. He knew that. He knew that she's living with a man now. But he doesn't speak truth to condemn this woman. He does it to bring her face to face with the problem of sin. She needs to understand, though, that she's not hopelessly bound up in her past and present choices and circumstances. She's not bound by those. That earlier offer of living water in reality means life, forgiveness, and freedom that's made by this man who obviously knows everything about her. It's his offer that can heal her. And then thirdly, what he does after that, which sometimes in real life people don't ever get to. They only tell us what's wrong. They don't give us a solution. Jesus gives us a solution. Be part of you've heard that saying, be part of the solution. How many people on social media you just see throwing darts? Like that dude that got on me that one time in the on Chino Connects about opening the church up, and blame me for all the homelessness in Chino. And they just love to throw darts, but they don't ever have a solution. Jesus' response to her is solution. Her response is revealing, though. First of all, she says, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say Jerusalem is where we need to go to worship. Who's right?" At that point, she might be changing gears a little bit, because after all, he just told her, "Oh, you're basically an adulteress. You've had 5 husbands. You're living in sin." So she changes gears a little bit, perhaps being a little invasive, to get away from the probing. But it might be an admission in reality that Jesus is 100% dead on. You're a prophet. You've looked at my heart. You know all about me. Because she'll return later to her village and say to her own people, "Come see a man who told me everything I've ever done." But then she links it, not with an evasion, but with an honest plea for help. She says, "Where do I go for life? Where can I get this water? You Jews say that the only place to offer the sacrifice that can cleanse my sin is the temple in Jerusalem. We say it's here on this mountain. So where do I go? How can I find God?" She's just pleading. Jesus tells her that pretty soon the locale of the worship, it will be irrelevant. By his death and resurrection, Jesus would destroy the external forms of worship on earth. And we know that the temple itself in 70 AD was flattened. And I mean burned to the ground, because all the gold, they wanted to get every ounce of gold out of it. It was flattened. True worship, Jesus is saying, is done in the human heart, in the human spirit, the spirit of truth, honestly and openly before God. It's not a put on with all the trappings and stained glass. But see, she can't believe. She can't believe it's that easy. She says, "Yes, I know you're right, but we must wait until the Messiah comes. We can't expect these things in our time, so tell me, where do I go?" She's not ignorant of God's truth at all. She connects worship in spirit and truth with the promised Messiah, which is theologically dead on. When he comes, he'll clear it up, and he'll tell us how to worship God. And at that point, I would just love to have been there in that conversation, especially the words. She tells Jesus that she's what? Waiting for the Messiah. And then what does Jesus say? "I who speak to you am he." Man, I get goosebumps. I got goosebumps at first service, and I got them right now. "I who speak to you am he." Now she knows, unmistakably. Jesus identifies himself, who he is, and therefore what he has the power to do. Now she must respond in some way. Her response now, the village people's response later, indicate that she did receive the word, either right then or soon, and they believed that Jesus is who he claimed to be. Jesus could have asked her, like I said earlier, to join them on their journey, but he doesn't. He allows her to go back to the village and be the yeast that will bring many more to belief in him. Her witness by going home is infinitely more powerful than if she would have come with them. Each and every day, we have an opportunity to hear Jesus speak to us. We can hear those same words, right? We can hear those words, "I who speak to you am he." 7 little words, but 7 words that changed the world then and change the world now. "I who speak to you am he." Lord, help us to be bold in our convictions, but bolder yet in love, as we go out into a world that's hurting and so in need of you. Amen.